like to talk a bit about education and employment. One of the problems, at least in my perspective now in more people's view, is that too many times employment and education is kind of a tag-along. We have the more severe problems to start off with. We have crime, we have substance abuse, and rather than in the beginning making it very important, it's looked at later, and it's important for policymakers to start bringing that more to the fore. Programs are needed that bring in education, training, and meaningful employment as primary goals. The Department of Labor of the last 5 years has been doing extensive work in communities with people ages 14 to 24, trying to help them get more meaningful employment. And so that work is going forward. It hasn't been brought together very well, though. There's not an integration yet across the different systems. The partnership of treatment providers, criminal justice system, government, educators, and businesses would be an effective way to develop innovative aftercare programs incorporating recovery, employment, and educational best practices. NIDA has funded 10 research centers in a program called CJDATS, which stands for Criminal Justice Drug Abuse Treatment Studies, CJDATS. And these 10 research centers across the country are conducting systematic studies of both prison substance abuse treatment and then transition into the community and looking at the role of aftercare and a variety of models. That has grown directly out of the Stay Out work, Projects Reform and Recovery, and then the more recent studies throughout the country showing the effectiveness of prison substance abuse treatment, specifically the Therapeutic Community approach. In March of 2004, we pulled together a number of studies that have been done in California. California has really taken the lead in this movement. Currently, I believe there's approximately 32 programs have grown out of that original Donovan Amity program that demonstrated the results that we have talked about. And these programs are working across the state, and UCLA Research Group has been evaluating those studies. And recently, we have put together a special issue of the Prison Journal that shows or gives a flavor of some of that work. And I'll show a few slides to give you an idea of that work. You can see the actual title of the journal is Correctional Drug Treatment Outcomes Focus on California. Much of what's been spoken about today is written in one chapter by Michael Prendergast and myself, reviewing the research, the ideas, the developments, policy developments, bringing us up to at least the current picture of what's happening in the state of California. And it gives you a good national picture. The next one I'll talk about in a minute is the 5-year outcome study of the Amity program at Donovan Prison. That was funded by NIDA. And then you can see the next one, the California Treatment Expansion Initiative, Aftercare Participation, Recidivism, and Predictors of Outcome. This paper reviews the larger picture using file data looking across programs, again, replicating much of the same results that we've been talking about. We have 3 more studies in that special issue. One is on a women's program. Another one is risk and prison substance abuse treatment outcomes, replication and challenge. That's another study I'll mention in a little more detail. And then there's one about client perceptions of prison-based therapeutic community drug treatment programs. That one, let me say a word or two about that study before I speak about a few of the others above. Looking at the perceptions, speaking to clients, that has been a problem in the field, typically in corrections, there's this sense that people have broken the law, which is true, and that they deserve to be punished, and just deserts. And then in substance abuse, substance abusers are perceived commonly as people who have self-inflicted problems. So given that these people need correction, or they need to be treated, we have ideas, and many very good ones, that work quite well, but we kind of impose them on clients, and we tell them that they really need to do it, must do it, it's good for them. And that's, true to a large degree. The missing piece, though, is getting more information from the client. What's working for the client, what's not? What kind of obstacles? How do we have to change the program, perhaps? Sometimes, how do you improve programs? Well, to do that, you really need to talk to people who the program's not working for. Typically, those are people who we call dropouts, and we kind of reject them. We say, well, the program just didn't work for them, they weren't ready for it, they had too severe problems. But we're missing very important information by not doing that. So this study is one of a small number of studies that really goes out and looks at client perceptions and its relationship to treatment effectiveness, and now more recently we're looking at treatment outcomes related to perception of the client. We're finding it makes a major difference. It's a very important factor. I'd like to spend a few moments on the 5-year study of the Amity program at Donovan. This is one of the rare 5-year studies. There's not been many of these. Basically, at 5 years, we did very well. 90% of the original participants in the study were located, and we were able to conduct interviews on 81% of these people. Based on a very conservative approach, which I've been talking about, the intent to treat approach, which I've explained, control versus everybody comes into the front door treatment, even if they drop out in one day, we found that the treatment group, the Amity group at 5 years, still had significantly lower rates of reincarceration than the control group. That's for the total group now. So it's not simply the aftercare group, but it's everybody. Then, and perhaps most important, as in previous reports at the 1-year and 3-year follow-up of this cohort, we found very powerful results in those who went to aftercare and remained in aftercare. We hadn't reported in the prior studies, but at 5 years, we also looked at employment. So not only did we have a very much lower reincarceration rates, very low substance abuse rates in this group, we also had major improvements in employment. The next slide describes the study of risk and prison substance abuse treatment outcomes, a replication and challenge. Basically, there's a finding in the literature that those program participants in prison who have more severe criminal histories, they do better, and we look at them later. If you have people with lower criminal histories, they are not that bad to begin with, and they don't show as big a change. Now, with a prison population that already have had quite a life of disadvantage, deviance, they're not newcomers to the criminal justice system. So we looked at our data, and we wanted to see if the low-risk people versus the high-risk people, how they did later. And sure enough, the impressive reduction in recidivism were found for both groups. A bit more for the high-risk groups, but because the role of aftercare, especially that period with prison, is so powerful, that even those at low risk, you still get very strong outcomes. Now, it's important to be clear, though, that when you're speaking about intensity of interventions, that in the beginning of the spectrum, in the beginning of engagement with the criminal justice system, younger people who have minimal crime, it's been found that if you give them too much, if you engage them too much in the system, or you try to overtreat them, you actually can even get negative results. And that's true, and that's very important. But this needs to be understood in the larger spectrum. Beginners, newbies in the system versus those who have been in prison, have really developed entire lifestyles that are based upon or very involved with crime. And there, everybody needs an opportunity, I believe. Anybody who's in prison really should be at least given the opportunity to get treatment. I'd like to speak a bit about what we might call the critical components or critical elements of TC treatment. We've looked at this phenomenon. This is a combination of clinical and research observations. And these observations begin to help us understand evidence-based practices. To show results is one thing, and that's critical, of course. But then, if you're going to try to replicate a program, it's important to understand the principles of the program and the critical components. One is that the treatment approach must be based on a set of clear and consistent principles and have a philosophy that underlies it. It's not simply providing services, but it needs to be in an understanding of the client's needs, and come from sound clinical experience. Two, in prison, it's very key, if you hope to deliver meaningful treatment, that the environment is a secure environment, that there's not physical danger, that people can feel confident they can speak in groups and work through their problems. Three, the recruitment of qualified staff who can learn the approach. And in the TC work, it's very important to have people who themselves have gone through the therapeutic community and learned it from their own experience, from the inside of that experience. Next point is you need rules. You need rules and consequences. This is true in any learning situation, especially though in a human change situation. You need to have rules so people know what expectations are, and they have a chance to break those rules and make mistakes, because that's where a great deal of learning takes place. And there, the treatment system has to be able to deliver reasonable consequences based upon whatever rules were broken. Over time in the prison work, this specific principle has come to be accepted. Initially, prison administrators had a lot of difficulty giving programs enough room for clients to make some minor mistakes and minor infractions, and let the program really deal with that more as a learning experience rather than simply punishment. And we know from the psychological literature and from everything we know about learning is that, again, you have to be able to make mistakes, not be overly punished, but you need appropriate consequences that can help, direct you and teach you so you can learn how to do it. Number 5 in this slide is critical, and this is the importance of using people in recovery, people who themselves perhaps who have been in prison, who have been addicted to drugs, and have gone through a change process, and who are credible role models. They really display the behaviors that they're speaking about, that they're talking about, and they've shown change so that clients, especially in prison, can respect and recognize that these were people from their neighborhoods perhaps who are very difficult criminals who maybe were respected in the ghetto for their crimes, and now they've essentially turned around, they've transformed, they've made a change into a healthy lifestyle. Next is the use of peer role models and peer pressure. Having counselors who can display behaviors, who can teach, who understand the program is very important. But you need to have people in the program at different levels. So as a person is going through their changes and going through the levels of the structured program, they have peers, they have friends who can advise them, who have just gone through that, and they can relate to. Now, maintenance of treatment program integrity, autonomy, flexibility, and openness. One of the things that we have found, and this has been a little bit controversial, and there's different points of view, but our general finding has been that it's very important to have contractors who come in with proven track records into the correctional environment, who can maintain their own autonomy, but can work very well with the correctional administration. And it turns out that the TC model is a natural fit in the correctional environment. The TC model has rules, has levels, has hierarchies, has consequences. It's a place of moral conduct and behavior, and there's a certain amount of the philosophies of both corrections with its mission of containment and corrections and the TC structure. Now, over time, at this point, I would think, and I've been to conferences where I've seen commissioners of corrections speak, and the very well accepted understanding at this point is that prisons include rehabilitation, and that substance abuse treatment has been widely accepted as part of the mission in corrections throughout the country. Yet prisons are still prisons. So you'll see another important critical factor is the isolation of the program. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to do meaningful programming in general population. The negativity, the cops and robbers, the opposition between the inmates and prison administration that's natural in those environments, you need to be able to step away from that. And the therapeutic community is an approach that is expert in designing environments and learning environments, but you need to have an isolated unit and the wherewithal to be doing that. Point number 9 refers to the time in treatment that the literature has shown is necessary to produce results. From the original staying out research, we found that 9 to 12 months produced the best results. Now that's time in treatment generally throughout the field of addiction treatment has been found to be a key factor, which is pretty understandable when you think about it. A person comes from a life of difficulty, disadvantage, abuse, crime, and they've lived that for a number of years. So to change, to meaningfully intervene in those patterns, it would take a reasonable amount of time to do that. Because we have wanted to produce results in the community, the placement of the program at the last part of a prison sentence is critical. So in the last 9 to 12 months before getting out, and then connecting it up to post-prison aftercare. And that's number 10, is the continuity of care. You can see from the data that if there's to be long-term results and to maintain those drops in reincarceration, and by the way, it's not simply drops in reincarceration, it's related drops in substance abuse, and that there's more employment, that goes together. Certain questions remain to be looked at. And these are important questions, and they've not been systematically studied as of now. And I just want to go through these, and hopefully, over time, these will be explored. First one, what about only doing aftercare and not prison treatment? Prison treatment doesn't last longer than a year alone without aftercare. What about aftercare alone and not prison treatment? Now, you need to be careful when you look at these things, though. 1-year outcomes count. They matter. So we shouldn't simply discard them. I mean, there's no treatment that lasts for a lifetime. So With that being said, though, we still need to look at aftercare alone in a carefully designed study. Next point, what about different lengths of prison treatment with and without aftercare? Perhaps you can have prison treatment that goes less than 9 months to a year, but have more extensive aftercare treatment. Because apparently, based on the literature, and this is many studies at this point, both in prison and in the community, time and treatment is really critical. But where the treatment happens, that's not really clearly been delineated. It's not well understood at this point. Related to that point, what is the optimum combination of duration of both in-prison treatment and community treatment? What is the optimal combination? We don't know that yet. And it seems at this point that that's important work to be done. Next point is, what are the best treatment models to deal with geographic dispersion of offenders after release from prison? This relates to the issue of continuity of treatment, of a model of treatment providers. When we look at the Donovan work, part of its potency and its ability to produce results may very well have been related to the aftercare being operated by the same people who did the prison work. And that by having counselors form relationships both in prison and then following prison. So there's a real continuity of change and respect for accomplishments and those ongoing relationships. Now, prisons typically are put out in places far from communities, and when people leave prison, they are dispersed. And though in large metropolitan areas like Los Angeles and New York, of course they come to these cities, but it still has the problem for the rural person, the person who is returning to a rural environment where there's much less treatment resources. Finally, what are the cost and cost benefits of prison treatment and aftercare? At this point now, we have some studies that have been done in the last few years showing a significant cost benefits. And this work is still underway, and in the CJ DATS initiative, cost-benefit work is a major factor, and these matters will be explored.